Imagine this. You're sitting alone in a cafe. The hum of conversation swirls around you. The clink of spoons against ceramic. Laughter from a nearby table. It's all perfectly ordinary. You sip your coffee, scroll through your phone, and try to ignore the ache in your chest. The subtle, persistent tightness that never quite goes away. You're successful. Driven, even. You've done everything right. But beneath the calm exterior, something is quietly unraveling. Suddenly, a child starts crying. Not just crying, sobbing, guttural from the deepest part of the body. It's not your child. You don't even know them. But for a moment, just a flicker, you feel it. A strange tightening in your stomach. Your jaw clamps. Your hands tremble slightly. You don't understand why. You shake it off. Rationalize it. Maybe the coffee's too strong. Maybe you didn't sleep well. But what if that tremor wasn't from the present moment at all? What if it was a ghost, one you've carried for decades, long buried in a place you no longer look? You leave the cafe, resume your life, and the moment fades. But the question remains. Why do certain things, sounds, smells, glances, pierce through your armor so suddenly, so viciously, that you feel like you're 5 years old again, helpless and unseen? And here's the paradox. You survived, you endured, you moved on. The trauma is in the past, objectively, but emotionally, neurologically, philosophically, you never left the room it happened in. You are still there, still 6 years old, watching your parents fight through the crack in the door. Still 8, trying to make yourself invisible because affection has become unpredictable. Still 11, learning to earn love with silence or perfection. Still pretending it didn't matter, that you grew up fine, that none of it touched you, but it did. And what if your entire adult identity, your ambition, your relationships, your fears, was shaped not by conscious choice, but as a defense mechanism against the chaos you once couldn't control? Here is the uncomfortable truth. Childhood trauma doesn't shout. It whispers. It infects your preferences, disguises itself as your personality, makes you believe that you are who you chose to be, when in reality, you are who you had to become to survive. And so you become high-achieving, not from joy, but because approval meant safety. You become independent, not from empowerment, but because dependence once led to betrayal. You become emotionally intelligent, not from wisdom, but from years of walking on eggshells, studying every flicker of tone and tension in a room just to stay safe. What if everything you admire about yourself was born not from your essence, but from your wound? This is not a condemnation, it's an invitation. Because the mind is a master illusionist. It constructs stories out of pain, wraps them in narratives of resilience, and buries the raw origin deep beneath layers of logic and habit. It convinces you that what you fear is normal, that your limits are reasonable, that your detachment is just being mature. But what if your maturity is actually a mask? What if the emotional numbness you call calm is actually dissociation? What if the self-reliance you pride yourself on is isolation in disguise? What if every time you said, "I'm fine," you were really just saying, "I learned not to need anyone because once needing someone almost destroyed me"? Now ask yourself, when was the last time you truly felt safe? Not safe from violence or danger, but safe enough to be soft, to cry without apology, to rest without guilt, to speak without filtering your soul through 20 layers of anticipation and fear. And if that place doesn't exist, if that person doesn't exist, How long have you been navigating life with a nervous system that thinks love is a threat and vulnerability is a trap? Here's the deeper question. If your trauma is still living inside you, silently scripting your behaviors, choosing your partners, shaping your worldview, can you really call your choices free? Are you free when your first instinct in conflict is silence? Are you free when compliments make you uncomfortable, but criticism feels like home? Are you free when the idea of peace makes you anxious because you've only ever known chaos? And if not, what would it take to be free? Because freedom isn't the absence of pain. It's the reclamation of self. It's the moment you stop living as the echo of your past and begin speaking in the voice that was buried underneath the wreckage. But to do that, you must go where most refuse to go. Not forward, not backward, but inward, to the hidden architecture of your psyche, the blueprint written in fear, shame, and unmet needs, to the root, not the symptom, to the moment where the fracture occurred and you unconsciously decided, this is who I must become to survive. That's where we begin. But before we can break free, we must first see what binds us. Trauma doesn't announce itself like a broken bone or a bleeding wound. It arrives silently, often without your awareness, and then it stays. It does not age with you, it calcifies, it integrates itself into your nervous system, embedding into your reactions, your attachments, and your sense of self. And perhaps the most insidious part, you come to believe that this version of you, the guarded, overachieving, overly empathetic, emotionally restrained version, is your true self. But what if it's not? To begin understanding how childhood trauma quietly governs your existence, we must first realize what trauma really is. Not just the dramatic, obvious instances, abuse, violence, abandonment, but the subtle ones too. Emotional neglect, invalidation, growing up in an environment where your inner world was not seen, not heard, or worse, punished. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." That is trauma's most cunning disguise. It doesn't feel like trauma, it feels like who you are. You are not afraid of love, you're just cautious. You're not emotionally unavailable, you're independent. You don't fear abandonment, you just don't need anyone. But these aren't traits, they're strategies. Psychologically, childhood trauma disrupts the formation of what developmental theorists call a cohesive self. According to Heinz Kohut and object relations theory, a child develops their sense of self by seeing themselves mirrored accurately by caregivers. If a child's emotional reality is consistently invalidated, ignored, or distorted, they internalize one catastrophic belief: who I am is not acceptable. And so a false self begins to take shape, a persona carefully crafted to gain safety, approval, or invisibility, whatever the environment required. Jean-Paul Sartre argued that humans are condemned to be free, meaning we're thrust into existence without a script, yet burdened with the weight of defining ourselves. But how can one define themselves authentically if their earliest blueprint for survival required self-erasure? This is the great paradox. You had to become someone else to stay alive emotionally. But now you're living that someone else as though it's truly you, and the culture you grow into doesn't help. Modern society worships productivity, stoicism, self-reliance. It rewards dissociation and punishes emotional authenticity. It tells the traumatized person that their numbness is maturity, Their over-functioning is discipline. Their hypervigilance is awareness. So the wound gets woven into the reward system. Arthur Schopenhauer spoke of human existence as a pendulum swinging between suffering and boredom. In many ways, childhood trauma locks the pendulum toward suffering but disguises it as purpose. The sufferer becomes the fixer, the pleaser, the achiever, desperate to earn worthiness they never believed was innate. This isn't just philosophical, it's neurological. Repeated early trauma, especially in attachment relationships, rewires the developing brain. The amygdala becomes hypersensitive, interpreting neutral stimuli as threats. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for regulation and reasoning, becomes overwhelmed by the limbic system's constant alarm bells. The child learns the world is unsafe. People are unpredictable. I must stay small, perfect, or invulnerable. And decades later, you find yourself in a boardroom, in a marriage, in a friendship, still scanning the room for danger, still silencing your voice, still asking, am I too much? Not enough. What do they need me to be? You are not reacting to the present. You are obeying the rules of a forgotten battlefield. And the danger of this is existential. Because trauma doesn't just fragment the self, it fragments meaning. Viktor Frankl, the Holocaust survivor and author of Man's Search for Meaning, wrote, "When a person can't find a deep sense of meaning, they distract themselves with pleasure. But for the traumatized child, now adult, pleasure itself becomes confusing. It feels unsafe to relax. Joy feels undeserved. Peace feels unfamiliar. So you chase intensity instead, drama, passion, adrenaline, or you numb it all with work, substances, scrolling, caretaking, anything to avoid that echoing silence inside, anything to avoid being still enough to hear the cry of the inner child you abandoned long ago." Aldous Huxley warned that we live in a world where distraction has become a substitute for transformation, and nowhere is this more evident than in the lives of those shaped by trauma. We don't heal, we optimize. We don't reflect, we perform. We don't feel, we manage. But management is not freedom. Management is survival wearing a tailored suit. And here's where it gets more insidious. Because you might not even want to look at your trauma. You might defend your persona. After all, it worked. It got you here. It protected you. It made you lovable, or at least tolerated. But at what cost? How many times have you felt like an outsider in your own life? How many times have you said yes when every cell in your body screamed no? How many times have you achieved something only to feel nothing at all? These are the symptoms of a soul estranged from itself. You are not broken, but you are split. And the split cannot be healed by more performance, more success, or more affirmation from the outside. It can only be healed by returning to the source, by meeting the child who was silenced and asking, for the first time, what did you lose to survive? What parts of yourself were buried so you could be acceptable? What dreams were abandoned because no one was there to nurture them? What truths were denied because they threatened the illusion of family, of love, of normalcy? This is not a casual inquiry. It is a reckoning, because once you see how deeply the trauma shaped you, not just in how you feel, but in who you think you are, there is no going back. You begin to question everything. Is this relationship love or just familiarity in disguise? Is this career my calling or simply the safest path to external validation? Are these beliefs mine or inherited from someone who never knew me? And once the questioning begins, the illusion trembles. That trembling, terrifying as it may feel, is the first sign of awakening. Imagine walking through life with a mirror that only reflects parts of you, the parts others once found acceptable, convenient, or useful. You dress each morning, study your reflection, and believe it's the whole truth. But it's not. It never was. The rest, the messy, tender, wild, hurting, radiant parts, are cloaked in shadow, denied so long ago that you've forgotten they were ever there. And so you live your life half visible, half alive. But you function, you excel, you even smile. No one suspects that underneath it all, something vital is missing. This is the unseen consequence of childhood trauma. Not that it wounds you, but that it rewrites your map of reality. And worse, it hides the rewrite so thoroughly, so subtly, that you mistake it for the original. Most people don't realize they're living under the tyranny of trauma because the consequences are not loud, they are quiet, deceptive, dressed in normality. You don't recognize them as consequences at all. You call them habits, preferences, personality. You say you don't trust easily. But what you really mean is, I learned early and deeply that trusting meant pain. You say you just like being independent. But beneath that is a primal memory. Depending on someone once meant betrayal, so I'd rather be alone than risk that again. You say you don't do drama or don't feel things too deeply, but truthfully, feeling deeply was once a liability. So you taught yourself how not to feel. The brain is a brilliant engineer. When trauma occurs, especially in the formative years, it doesn't just scar, it adapts. Neural pathways shift, hormonal responses recalibrate. Your entire perception of safety, love, and identity becomes altered. This is called neuroplasticity, and while it can be a force of healing, it can also entrench you in survival patterns you believe are truth. Let's go deeper. According to developmental neuroscience, early trauma conditions the amygdala to become hyper-responsive. This part of your brain, the fear center, starts to interpret even minor relational discomfort as danger. A raised voice, a delayed text reply, a neutral face, they all light up the same alarm. You're not safe. You're not loved. You're about to be hurt. This becomes your baseline reality. So what do? You over-apologize. You shrink. You obsessively replay conversations. You scan for tone shifts. You preemptively abandon people before they can leave you. You stay in toxic dynamics because the familiarity of pain feels safer than the uncertainty of love. And no one sees it, because on the outside you're just sensitive, just intense, just a little anxious. But inside, you're on fire. Your nervous system is in a perpetual state of alert, hijacking your body with cortisol and adrenaline. Over time, this leads to what trauma experts like Dr. Bessel van der Kolk call body memory. Your body keeps the score long after your mind has forgotten the story. Chronic fatigue, digestive issues, autoimmune conditions, insomnia. These aren't random. They're the embodied echoes of years lived in fear, in suppression, in emotional exile. And here's the cruel irony. The world rewards you for your trauma responses. Your hyper-independence, that's called being a go-getter. Your perfectionism, high standards. Your inability to rest, drive. Your emotional repression, stoicism. Society doesn't see a person in pain. It sees a strong, resilient, capable adult. And so the trauma is not only unseen, it is celebrated, but there is a cost. The cost is intimacy, creativity, aliveness. You build walls around your heart, then wonder why no one gets in. You plan your entire life meticulously, but feel empty when you get there. You seek out chaos, not because you want to, but because it mirrors the home you once knew. You live in loops. You attract people who echo your childhood dynamics, not because you're broken, but because familiarity feels like safety, even if it's laced with pain. This is the paradox of unresolved trauma. What once kept you alive is now slowly killing your joy. You may have noticed a pattern in your life. Relationships that start passionately but end in betrayal. Friendships that feel one-sided. A tendency to sabotage peace. A resistance to pleasure. A fear of stillness. These aren't failures, they're messages. Your subconscious is trying to resolve the past in the present. It's reenacting old wounds in new costumes, hoping desperately that this time the story will end differently, but it won't. Not until you interrupt the script. And it gets deeper still. Cognitive biases like confirmation bias and negativity bias become amplified in traumatized minds. You unconsciously seek out information, people, and scenarios that validate your wounded beliefs. I'm not enough. I'm too much. Love always leaves. I must earn affection. So when someone treats you kindly, you flinch. You suspect ulterior motives. You feel discomfort in their warmth. Why? Because it contradicts your internal model of the world. And the brain, always favoring consistency over truth, tries to reject the anomaly, even if it's love. This is the prison. You long for freedom, but your body fears it. You crave love, but your psyche doesn't trust it. You want to rest, but your nervous system believes that stillness equals danger. And this is not your fault. You didn't choose this. You didn't choose to be wounded. You didn't choose to grow up in an environment that required you to betray your emotional truth, to be safe, seen, or simply to survive. But now it is your responsibility. Because left unchecked, this hidden trauma doesn't just define your inner world. It leaks into society. It shapes parenting. It molds leadership. It colors culture. A generation raised to suppress emotion gives birth to another generation that doesn't know how to express it. A society that glorifies performance over presence produces leaders who are charismatic but disconnected, efficient but unempathetic. Traumatized children become traumatized adults, and traumatized adults, unless awakened, build traumatized worlds. Unless something breaks the chain, unless someone, maybe you, chooses to stop the cycle. But before you can break it, you must see it, feel it, name it. You must sit with the shivers, the flashbacks, the inexplicable loneliness. You must look your inner child in the eye and say, I see you, I believe you, I won't abandon you again. Only then does healing begin. Not as a project, not as self-improvement, but as a return to the self before the world told you who to be, a return to the voice you silenced, a return to the life you were meant to live, not the one your wounds wrote for you. But how? How do you begin to untangle a lifetime of survival? How do you reclaim what trauma convinced you to bury? How do you break free? What if freedom doesn't begin with healing, but with rebellion? Not the kind with fists in the air or slogans on banners, but the quiet, sacred rebellion of saying, I will no longer live as the version of myself created by fear. Because that's what breaking free truly means. It means refusing to continue the performance. It means walking away from the identity you inherited through pain. It means burning the mask you wore to survive, even if you don't yet know who you are without it. And make no mistake, this will feel like death, because in a way, it is. The death of the false self, the unraveling of the myth. The end of the story that said you had to earn love, silence your feelings, prove your worth. That story kept you alive, but it's not your story anymore. The rebellion begins here. It starts the moment you stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" and start asking, "Who taught me to see myself this way?" You begin to notice the echoes, the way your inner critic sounds eerily like a parent's voice, the way you flinch at praise because it feels like a setup, the way you distrust ease as though joy must always come with a price. You begin to question the rules. Why do I believe that rest is laziness? Who told me that love is something to be earned? Why do I measure my value by my usefulness? And then comes the radical part. You stop obeying them. You rest anyway. You say no, even when it makes you shake. You cry in front of people. You ask for help. You dare to take up space without apologizing for it. These are not just acts of self-care. They are acts of war. Because in a world shaped by trauma, where most people are still performing some version of okay, authenticity is a revolution. Vulnerability is a weapon. Joy is an act of defiance. The rebellion requires courage, not the absence of fear kind, but the walk into the fire kind. The do it while shaking kind. Because your body will resist. Your mind will scream. Your inner protectors, those parts of you that built the survival persona, will panic. They will say, "This is unsafe. This is unfamiliar. Go back." But you don't go back. You breathe. You ground. You stay. And in that staying, something extraordinary begins to happen. You start to feel not just the pain, but also the aliveness beneath it. The joy you thought was gone. The laughter that doesn't feel forced. The quiet sense of being okay without needing to explain it. You start to remember who you were before the world told you who to be. This isn't a linear path. Healing is not a checklist or a 5-step plan. It's a spiral. You return again and again to the same wounds, but each time with more awareness, more compassion, more power. And sometimes rebellion means not fixing, but witnessing. You sit with the ache instead of numbing it. You hold space for your rage without apologizing. You let grief move through you like a storm and trust that it's cleansing something deeper. Carl Jung once wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." That's the real rebellion, not becoming someone new, but embracing all that you already are, especially the parts you were taught to hide. It also means rewriting your definition of strength. Strength is not emotional suppression, it's emotional fluency. It's being able to name your feelings, to sit with them, to share them without shame. It's being able to say, "This hurt me," without needing to prove it. It's being able to love, even when you're scared, to trust, even after betrayal, to show up as yourself, even if your voice shakes, your hands tremble, and your past screams. You can't, because you can, and you won't do it alone. There's a reason revolutions are rarely solitary. Healing may begin in isolation, but it matures in connection, in finding spaces, therapeutic, relational, spiritual, where your truth can be spoken aloud and still held, where you are not asked to justify your pain or perform your healing, where your story is not just heard, but honored. In those spaces, shame begins to die. You realize that your trauma doesn't make you damaged, it makes you human. That the very adaptations you once saw as flaws were brilliant, necessary strategies for survival. And that now you are allowed to outgrow them. Let's talk about that. Outgrowing. You don't fix the wounded child inside you. You reparent them. You become what they never had. You become safety. You become gentleness. You become the voice that says, You're allowed to feel that. I'm here, I'm not going anywhere. And slowly that child begins to trust you. They stop screaming for attention through sabotage, anxiety, or people-pleasing. They stop hijacking your relationships. They stopped running the show. Because they no longer have to. They are not exiled anymore. They are home. And that's when the most radical transformation begins. Integration. You are no longer just surviving. You are becoming whole. Your past is still there, but it no longer dictates your future. The pain still whispers, but it no longer writes your script. You still remember, but you are no longer defined by what happened to you. You begin to live, not as a reaction, not as a performance, but as a conscious choice. You choose relationships that reflect your truth, not your trauma. You choose boundaries that protect your peace, not your reputation. You choose work that nourishes your soul, not just your ego. You choose you. And the world, sensing the shift, begins to respond. Because healed people live differently. They listen differently. They love differently. They raise children who aren't taught to shrink. They build relationships rooted in presence, not projection. They become mirrors, not of pain, but of possibility. You can be one of them, not because you've never been broken, but because you chose to become whole again. And in doing so, you discover something even deeper than healing. You discover truth. But what is that truth? What lies beyond the rebellion? What happens when the masks are gone, the armor is down, and the self, raw, luminous, ancient, is fully revealed? That answer waits at the end. There comes a moment, often quietly, after the storm of healing has passed, when the chaos recedes and something unfamiliar begins to emerge. Not peace exactly, not yet, but stillness. A kind of silence that isn't empty but full, heavy with presence, thick with something sacred, and in that stillness you feel it. The self. Not the self you've built to be loved, not the self that was shaped by trauma or driven by fear, but the one who has been waiting beneath it all, watching, unchanged, untouched. You realize you were never broken, only buried. This is the ultimate truth. Not that healing makes you better, not that trauma made you weak, but that beneath every defense, every survival instinct, every adaptation, there is a self that was never destroyed, only forgotten. You don't become whole by adding pieces to yourself. You become whole by remembering you were never anything else. Everything the world told you to hide, your sensitivity, your rage, your softness, your hunger, your fear, these weren't flaws. They were signals, indicators of your depth, invitations to return. Trauma didn't steal yourself. It simply interrupted your connection to it. And reconnection isn't a lightning bolt. It's a slow turning inward, a reintroduction, like seeing an old friend in the mirror and saying, "There you are. I almost forgot what you look like." But the most radical realization isn't just that your true self survived. It's that everything you ran from, every emotion, every memory, every shattered belief was never trying to destroy you. It was trying to wake you. Pain is not punishment. It is invitation. Grief is not weakness. It is testimony. Fear is not your enemy. It is your compass pointing to the part of you that still needs your love. We've been told that healing is a process of subtraction. Remove the trauma, erase the scars, eliminate the pain. But what if it's the opposite? What if true healing is expansion? Not getting rid of your past, but growing so large that it no longer defines you. What if the goal is not to become someone else, but to become so fully yourself that nothing, not rejection, not shame, not even trauma, can distort your truth. That is what happens when you finally remember who you are. You stop seeking validation in places that only ever taught you to beg. You stop performing for love that should have been yours without condition. You stop asking small questions like, "Am I enough?" and start living large answers like, "I was never not." And then the world begins to look different. Not because it changed, but because you did. You no longer read people's silence as evidence of your unworthiness. You no longer mistake comfort zones for safety. You no longer trade authenticity for belonging. You realize you are not here to be palatable. You are here to be whole. And that wholeness is not quiet or passive. It is feral. It is wild. It dances barefoot through the ruins of who you used to be and sets fire to every rule that once told you to stay small. Because when you remember your wholeness, you also remember your power. Not power over others, but power over your own narrative. The power to say, "This ends with me." The power to be the ancestor who breaks the pattern. The power to live as proof that healing is not only possible, but sacred. You become a walking permission slip for others to stop hiding, to stop performing, to stop pretending. Because your wholeness gives others a map back to theirs. And this isn't just personal, it's existential. Because if trauma can define a life, so can liberation. If the wounded child inside you can shape your entire worldview, so can the awakened adult. If pain can echo across generations, so can healing. But none of this happens unless someone is brave enough to remember what the world tried to make you forget. That you are already enough. That you are already worthy. That you belong, not because you earned it, but because you exist. And in that moment of remembrance, something else dissolves. Fear. Not the fear that keeps you alive, but the fear that kept you small. The fear of being seen. The fear of being real. The fear that if you show the world who you truly are, you would be abandoned. But you won't be, because now you know. Being abandoned by others is not as terrifying as abandoning yourself. You'd rather lose everything false than live one more day denying your truth. And that truth is vast. It is cosmic. You are not your past. You are not your trauma. You are not the voices in your head that say you're too much, too broken, too late. You are the sky that holds them all. And when you live from that truth, life stops being something to survive. It becomes something to feel, to taste, to create, to risk, not as an escape, but as a homecoming. Because what trauma fractured, truth restores. What shame silenced, truth sings. What fear buried, truth resurrects. And so the final, most powerful realization is this. You are not here to fix yourself. You are here to remember yourself in full color, full feeling, full power. That is the revolution. That is the return. That is the truth. Let it haunt you. Let it hold you. Let it become the way you move through the world. Not armored, but open. Not perfect, but present. Not fearless, but free.